July 7, 1944. Tanapag Plain, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Kenji Nakamura lay face down in the brittle grass, with his left thigh burning like iron from the jagged shrapnel that had torn through it at dawn. The last banzai charge had broken itself on the American lines in a roar of rifles and machine guns, and when the shouting faded, the only sound left near him was the click of insects and the far thud of artillery toward the north. He had been taught since basic training that capture meant disgrace, that the enemy would mock him, starve him, parade him like an animal. Yet when hands reached his collar and turned him gently onto his back, the faces over him were young men spattered with mud who did not look triumphant. A helmeted corpsman cut away the bloody trouser leg with swift, practiced motions, murmuring words Kenji did not understand, then held up a metal canteen cup to his lips and guided in water that was almost unbearably cold. A rubber tourniquet bit above the wound for a moment. The corpsman sprinkled powder into the laceration, sulfa, Kenji would learn later, and wrapped it with a clean bandage from a pouch stamped with a red cross. A needle slid beneath the skin of his forearm, and warmth began spreading through the terrible heat in his leg. "Morphine," the young American said to the Marine beside him, then tucked the spent syringe into Kenji's collar as a signal so no one would dose him again. Seconds earlier, Kenji had expected a boot, a curse, a bayonet. Instead, he felt the careful tug of bandage, the steadying pressure of a palm at his shoulder, the ordinary tone of men doing their jobs. He tried to lift his head when they shifted him onto a canvas stretcher, but the corpsman put a hand to his chest and said something that sounded like, "Okay, okay," as if talking to a friend. Kenji watched, dazed, as the aid station took shape under a canvas fly. One table for tourniquets and bandages, one for plasma bottles hung from improvised poles, a litter track hammered together from scrap lumber. He had the odd thought that these men could build anything out of anything. The corpsman tapped the plasma bottle, wrote a number on Kenji's tag, and moved on to the next casualty, American or Japanese. Kenji could not tell through the blood and dust. What he could tell, with the certainty of the man who feels a hand pull him back from a cliff, was that someone who didn't know his name had decided he should live. The field around Kenji, seen through the gap in the tent flap, told the larger story of a war that had pulled island after island under the same hard light. Saipan had erupted 3 weeks earlier when the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions and the Army's 27th Infantry Division came ashore on June 15th in the teeth of artillery from the bluffs. The American plan was as large as steel mills and shipyards could imagine. Hundreds of ships in the transport groups, battleships and cruisers throwing thousands of shells inland, landing craft, shuttling in steady lines like farm wagons in harvest season. The numbers dwarfed anything Kenji had been told to expect. Tens of thousands of men ashore in a day, hundreds of vehicles, stacks of supplies that rose like small hills along the beach. The defenders had fought back with everything they had, and still the line crept inland, past the sugarcane fields toward the high ground, toward Aslito Airfield that the Americans renamed Isley as soon as they had it. Even at sea, the clash ran to scale. When the carrier battle off the nearby Philippine Sea erupted on June 19, 20, pilots would later call it the Mariana's Turkey Shoot, because hundreds of Japanese planes were lost in a few hours to American fighter direction and radar, while the American carriers, dozens of them, with thousands of men aboard, kept launching and recovering aircraft with a clockmaker's rhythm. That ocean of power reached Kenji most intimately as water in his mouth, as clean bandage on his leg, as plasma hung from a makeshift pole. The aid station where he lay was one of many that leapfrogged forward with the lines, backed by battalion collecting points and regimental dressing stations, and further back by surgical hospitals that inflated under canvas in hours, with sterilizers hissing and operating lamps blazing against the dusk. Under the conventions, Americans swore to follow, even though Japan had not ratified the prisoner of war treaty for this war. Medical personnel were supposed to care for any wounded who came into their hands. In practice, it depended on fire and fear, and on the ordinary decency of a 19-year-old bending over a bleeding enemy because his training said all bleeding looked the same. After the last ferocious charge along the Tanapag Plain, hundreds of bodies marked the path of the attack, but dozens of wounded. Some Japanese soldiers like Kenji, some Korean laborers in patched uniforms, some civilians, were carried to the same shade. Before noon, the Marines and Army medics had already transfused more bottles of plasma than Kenji could count, each one a pale river dripping into an arm. When the casualties eased for a moment, a chaplain knelt beside a man on the next litter and spoke softly in English. A translator, one of the Nisei linguists attached to the divisions, moved along the line repeating words in Japanese, not to interrogate but to calm and to explain that they would be moved to a hospital ship as soon as boats could be spared. Kenji stared at the blue arc of the sky through the tent opening and tried to reconcile the world he had known, where surrender was shame and pain was to be endured in silence, with the steady clink of glass and the rustle of gauze around him. He had imagined nurses as figures out of a distant city. He had never imagined they would be foreign and gentle, and close enough that he could see the salt drying white on their sleeves. They took him down to the beach at last. 4 men on the poles, the litter, moving with the practiced sway that keeps a wounded man from feeling each footstep. The shore was a mechanical hive. Landing craft nosed in and backed out. Bulldozers shoved sand into ramps. A tractor tugged a string of trailers stacked with boxes. Cranes swung arcs against the sky at the cargo dumps. A line of litters waited near a painted sign the Americans had stuck into the sand, evac, while a petty officer with a clipboard counted heads, spoke into a handset, then waved the next squad forward. Kenji could see the hospital ship riding white in the roadstead beyond the line of gray transports, a floating beacon with broad green bands along her hull and a red cross as tall as a house. He did not know her name, only that the men around him looked toward her with the same expression with which thirsty men watch a rain cloud. The American medical service moved like a factory, and it could not have existed without the factories behind it. Crates of plasma and sulfa and dressings, thousands of morphine syrettes, collapsible cots by the hundred, gas-powered sterilizers, surgical instruments packed in oiled paper and stamped with dates. Even the litter on which he lay bore markings that told a story of production and distribution that ran from a metal press in an American city to this beach in the Marianas. The coxswain of the landing craft helped slide Kenji's litter aboard, then backed out and swung into the chop, motors thudding toward the white ship whose paint seemed impossibly clean after days of dust. On deck, men in white and khaki moved him along a path marked by ropes, and for the first time since his wound, Kenji smelled something like a hospital: alcohol, clean linen, a faint scent of carbolic. A nurse. He had never been this close to a woman not of his family since leaving home. Leaned over and looked directly into his eyes, and, in halting Japanese she had clearly practiced during the voyage west, told him he would be all right. He closed his eyes and felt hands shift him to a clean bed. He opened them again to a ceiling of white enamel and to a round light like a moon. His throat worked, and English words came out rough and broken. Arigato, he meant to say, thank you. Then the doctor's calm voice. the hiss of oxygen, the brief bite of anesthetic. In the ward later, when consciousness floated back, he lay among Americans with bandaged stumps, lungs full of fluid, fractures suspended in pulleys, and among Japanese like himself, each bed with the same white sheet, each patient with the same chalk mark on the metal frame, indicating pulse and temperature at the last round. He watched a pharmacist's mate show another how to wind a new roll of bandage on a spindle. He heard the murmur of a chaplain reading to a Marine 2 bunks over. He felt the cool touch of a thermometer under his tongue and wondered at the ordinariness of care, even for him, a man taught to expect none. The day's larger ledger had columns he could not see. Ashore, units were counting losses in hundreds and thousands. Afloat, the transport fleet recorded tons moved, gallons of fuel burned, sorties flown by the combat air patrol that kept the anchorage safe. The hospital ship logged operations completed, pints of blood transfused, patients embarked and transferred to rear areas. Her generator output ran to kilowatts and hours. Her laundry washed linens in batches of hundreds. Behind the ship stood the larger arithmetic of a nation that had learned to lay down ships by the week and aircraft by the hour, and to multiply medical care at the same pace until a ward that would have served a city block at home could be set humming within days off an island whose name most of its crew had learned only in the last month. From his bed by a porthole bleached with sun, Kenji watched the slow arc of the anchorage over the next week and measured his own recovery against the rhythms of the ship. Morning rounds meant the doctor with a clipboard and a penlight, the nurse with a tray of pills and the rubber bulb of a blood pressure cuff. Midday meant the rattle of carts and the shift change whisper along the corridor. Evening meant the clink of silverware on trays and the muted voice on the ship's loudspeaker announcing orderlies needed in the operating room. He learned to recognize the smell of ether and the cleaner chemical smell of newer anesthetics when the doors swung open. He learned to time his own pain against the chalk mark the nurse made on his chart. He learned, most bewildering of all, that kindness had its own procedures. When he tried to sit up alone and failed, a hand would appear without scolding. When he whispered a request through a Nice interpreter, water, blanket, help with the bedpan, the answer was not a lecture about shame but the rustle of linen and a nod. The interpreter, a young American of Japanese ancestry in army khaki, explained that the doctors treated wounds, not flags, that the Red Cross on the ship's side meant its crew was protected by law and by custom so long as they served anyone brought aboard, that his own relatives in California had been forced from their homes and sent inland after Pearl Harbor, yet he had volunteered and now translated for wounded prisoners because, he said with a small shrug, it was the right thing to do. Kenji listened and felt the map inside his head tilt. The Marine in the next bed, his left hand bandaged to the elbow, pointed at a playing card and grinned when Kenji guessed its name correctly. A corpsman complimented Kenji on his neat stitches when he tried to sew a rip in his own shirt. The nurse practiced a phrase of Japanese and laughed when she got it wrong. On the second evening, a chaplain in a white collar stopped, bowed, and said, in Japanese carefully learned for the purpose, that he prayed for all the wounded, and that home, for every man aboard, lay somewhere beyond the same horizon. Kenji did not know what to say to that. He knew only that the pain ebbed when the morphine came at regular times, and that the bandage was changed twice a day with clean hands, and that the idea of being mocked or tortured seemed farther away with each hour of the ship's routine. Beyond his porthole, other routines marked the progress of the campaign ashore. Smoke rose in thin lines above the ridge as artillery continued. Strings of landing craft still moved in steady columns to the beaches. At night, The anchorage lay in a scatter of riding lights, and far to the north, there were brief strips of lightning where naval guns flashed at targets along the cliffs. The war's scale remained immense, even framed by his small round window. He heard figures from passing officers, thousands of enemy dead after the banzai charge, hundreds of American casualties brought aboard across the fleet in a single afternoon, tens of thousands of meals cooked in the ship's galley since the operation began. He learned that when the fighting ended here, it would begin elsewhere, at Tinian next, at Guam, at places whose names he had heard only in training lectures. Somewhere on the ship, a radio clattered out reports from distant fronts. Burma's monsoon stalled columns in mud. In China, new airfields went in by the dozen. In Europe, divisions counted the miles between hedgerows after a June landing of a size almost impossible to imagine. Kenji turned from the porthole and looked down at the clean sheet tucked around his legs and understood, with a quiet astonishment that felt like shame and relief at once, that the way these strangers behaved toward their wounded and toward their prisoners said as much about the world they were building as the ships and planes that had brought them here. He did not know the words for that yet. He knew only the touch of cool water on a fevered skin, the steady note in a doctor's voice, the ritual of care that did not ask him who he had been before he bled. July 15, 1944, aboard the USS Solace, anchored off Saipan. Kenji Nakamura awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing softly in the steel corridor and the muted hum of a ship's generator. The pain in his thigh had lessened, dulled by days of treatment, but the deeper ache was in his mind, where everything he had been taught about Americans warred with what he saw each hour. The doctor who checked his wound spoke with the same calm tone he used for the Marine in the next bed, adjusting the dressing, explaining through the Nisei interpreter that the flesh was knitting well. A nurse replaced the empty plasma bottle with another and marked the chart at the foot of his bed, her face impassive but her movements precise. What astonished Kenji most was the sameness. The same medicines, the same white sheets, the same trays of food carried down the ward, whether the man beneath the blanket wore a Japanese uniform or an American one. He watched a corpsman lift a wounded American by the shoulders to drink broth and then, without hesitation, turned to do the same for a Japanese prisoner 2 beds away. The enemy's hand lingered just long enough to steady the cup against his lips. It was not friendship, Kenji told himself. It was simply procedure. But the consistency of it unnerved him more than any blow could have. His instructors in Manchuria had said surrender meant degradation, yet each morning his fever was charted, his pulse taken, his wound cleaned. When the chaplain passed, he left a small book of English and Japanese phrases at Kenji's bedside, a bridge made of words instead of iron. Kenji traced them with his finger, mouthing syllables he barely understood, while outside the porthole hospital, barges carried in more litters, each one another contradiction of what he had believed. The broader war pressed on in its own terrible rhythm while Kenji healed. Saipan's last defenders were hunted through caves and cliffs on the island's north end, where thousands of civilians had thrown themselves from the rocks at Marpy Point rather than be captured. The figures stunned even American reporters hardened by months of campaigns. Over 29,000 Japanese soldiers killed, perhaps 5,000 taken prisoner, and thousands of civilians dead in mass suicides. For the first time in the Pacific War, large numbers of Japanese troops had surrendered, breaking the myth of absolute resistance. American commanders noted how many of the prisoners were wounded, carried to hospitals like Solace and Relief, where beds filled quickly and operations continued around the clock. Each hospital ship carried nearly 400 patients, staffed by hundreds of doctors, nurses, and corpsmen, their wards illuminated by electric lamps that burned day and night. The scale of American medical power became evident in statistics whispered between officers. Since the landings, more than 13,000 American casualties had been treated, with hundreds evacuated to rear bases in Hawaii or to the West Coast within weeks. Plasma alone had been shipped in crates of 100 bottles, with over 18,000 units consumed in the first month of the Marianas operation. It was an industrial war fought not only with bullets, but with glass vials, sterile gauze, sulfa powder, and morphine, each a product of factories thousands of miles away, linked by a supply chain that reached unbroken from Chicago to the deck of a hospital ship at anchor in the Pacific. Kenji listened to the orderly statistics with the same disbelief he had felt at the bandage on his thigh. Japan's wounded often died of infection for want of a clean dressing. Here, even prisoners received drugs, scarce even in Tokyo. When the order came to transfer stable patients ashore to a rear hospital, Kenji felt dread knot in his chest, fearing the rough handling he had always imagined. Instead, corpsmen carried him carefully down the gangway, their boots ringing on steel, and settled him onto the bed of a truck lined with stretchers. The vehicle rolled through an American base that looked to Kenji like a city made overnight. Rows of Quonset huts curved in neat arcs, their corrugated roofs gleaming in the sun. Warehouses stacked with crates bore stencils from every state: steel from Pennsylvania, flour from Kansas, canned milk from Wisconsin. Bulldozers growled as they pushed new roads into the volcanic soil, while convoys of jeeps and trucks rattled along routes already crowded with traffic. At the field hospital tents, Kenji was slid gently into another bed, his tag updated, his name written in Roman letters on a card above his pillow. He turned his head to see an entire ward of Japanese prisoners separated from Americans only by a canvas partition, and he realized that even here, under canvas in the tropics, the routine of medicine continued unchanged. The doctor who examined him looked weary, his shirt dark with sweat, but his hands were steady. He explained through the interpreter that Kenji's wound would need another cleaning, then nodded to the nurse who prepared sterile instruments on a tray. Kenji clenched his teeth and waited for pain, but instead felt the cool wash of antiseptic and the brief sharpness of a scalpel followed by the gentle pressure of a suture. He was told he might walk again within a month if no infection returned. He lay back, stunned not by the operation itself, but by the absence of cruelty. It was not leniency or charity, it was process, and the process itself had room for him, even as a prisoner. The contrast with what Kenji knew of Japanese military medicine haunted him in long hours between treatments. He remembered the field hospital on Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, where a comrade had died screaming of tetanus without morphine. The orderlies too exhausted to restrain him, the surgeon cutting away tissue with a knife that had been cleaned in cold water. He remembered the stories whispered among troops about Unit 731, where prisoners were dissected alive in the name of science. Such things had been justified as sacrifices for victory, yet here the enemy extended their most advanced care to men they had fought only hours earlier. Numbers told the story more starkly than emotions. By mid-1944, the U.S. Army Medical Department operated 600 general hospitals worldwide, supported by 120,000 doctors and nurses, while Japan struggled to supply even its home islands with basic drugs. American industry produced more than 2 billion sulfa tablets by war's end. Japan had shortages so severe that doctors used salt water as intravenous fluid. Kenji overheard these statistics from an American officer briefing staff nearby, and the words lodged in his mind like splinters. How could a nation he had been told was decadent and divided mobilize such abundance? How could it treat its own wounded and its enemies alike with the same efficiency? He stared at the clean line of stitches on his thigh and felt the ground shift beneath his beliefs. Each day the war continued. Guam invaded on July 21st, Tinian only. Days later, the same supply chain delivered plasma and penicillin by the ton, carried by ships that also unloaded tanks and aircraft parts. Kenji knew now that the enemy's arsenal was not only steel and fire, but medicine and mercy. In the quiet of the ward, listening to the shuffle of nurses' shoes and the distant rumble of construction outside, he understood that his captivity was becoming an education. July 28, 1944, Tinian Island, only a few miles south of Saipan. From his cot in the canvas ward, Kenji Nakamura heard the thunder of naval guns across the channel as American battleships hammered the beaches of Tinian. The floor trembled faintly with each broadside, rattling the enamel basins lined along the wall. He had been moved inland to a larger hospital camp, a sprawling complex of tents and prefabricated huts laid out in rows like a village that had sprung from the volcanic earth in a single week. His wound, stitched neatly, was healing faster than he could believe, though the scar pulled when he tried to sit upright. Nurses checked his temperature every morning, and the same interpreter explained that infection was no longer feared. Sulfa and penicillin, the nurse said with a smile, had done their work. What struck Kenji most was the order of it all. Trucks rolled up with crates of bandages stamped Johnson & Johnson, rows of bottles of plasma gleaming like captured sunlight, tins of milk and cartons of cigarettes stacked beside the medical tents. Even the meals astonished him. Bread so white it looked unreal, meat thick on the plate, coffee dark and bitter but endlessly poured. He had not known such food since his childhood in Nagano, long before ration cards and shortages. One night, as rain drummed on the canvas above, he confessed through the interpreter to another prisoner in the next bed that he could no longer reconcile this abundance with what Tokyo radio had told them, that America was weak, starving, tearing itself apart. Here, the enemy fed him more than the Imperial Army had ever managed. Beyond the ward, the larger machine of war ground forward with unstoppable rhythm. On July 24th, U.S. Marines stormed Tinian's beaches in one of the most meticulously planned amphibious assaults of the Pacific, using dozens of LVT amphibian tractors and a deception landing to confuse Japanese defenders. Within 9 days, Tinian fell, its garrison of over 8,000 virtually annihilated. The Americans lost fewer than 400 killed in the operation, a statistic that spoke of overwhelming firepower and planning. For Kenji, still weak from blood loss, the war reached him in fragments: the rumble of artillery, the endless columns of trucks, the constant arrival of fresh supplies. He watched through the ward's opening as bulldozers carved new roads, as engineers erected Quonset huts for surgical wards, as water tanks and electric lines appeared where days earlier there had been scrub. Numbers circulated among the staff. In July alone, over 18,000 wounded had passed through Army and Navy hospitals in the Marianas. 4,000 operations had been performed. More than 100 tons of medical supplies consumed. The figures seemed unreal to Kenji, who remembered comrades on Guadalcanal dying for lack of a single bottle of quinine. Here, crates of drugs arrived by the truckload, unloaded with the same casual efficiency as ammunition or fuel. The Americans seemed to treat medicine as plentiful as bullets, and it shook him to his core. Each day brought small encounters that eroded his certainty. A young American orderly showed him how to prop his leg with pillows to ease the ache, and even drew a rough sketch so Kenji could follow the instructions. A nurse slipped him a candy bar, smiling when he hesitated, urging him to taste the sweet he had not known since childhood. When he whispered to the interpreter that he did not understand why the enemy showed such kindness, the interpreter shrugged. "It's the Red Cross," he explained. "We treat everyone." But Kenji could see it was more than regulation. He watched the same nurse laugh with a Marine who had lost an arm, then moments later adjust the blanket of a Japanese prisoner with the same tenderness. He watched a chaplain leave a Bible on a table, then offer a cigarette to a prisoner who bowed in thanks. Even the guards seemed less hostile than he expected. They kept rifles slung, but many chatted idly with the orderlies, some even joking with the interpreters in a mix of English and Japanese. The fear of torture or mockery that had haunted him since capture now seemed like a distant nightmare. Instead, his humiliation came from within. Shame that his country had prepared him to hate these men. Shame that he had believed the promises of victory while the enemy's factories produced both bombs and bandages on a scale Japan could never match. By the end of July, Kenji was strong enough to hobble with a crutch along the ward, his leg supported by a fresh dressing. He leaned heavily but felt the muscles returning. Outside, he saw the scale of the hospital more clearly. Rows of tents with hundreds of cots, operating theaters with electric lamps glowing through canvas walls, laundry tents where steam rose from boiling vats, kitchens turning out thousands of meals each day. An officer told him, through the interpreter, that the hospital camp could handle up to 2,000 patients at once, with teams of surgeons rotating in shifts so operations never ceased. Kenji thought of Japan's hospitals, where 200 beds seemed enormous, where electricity failed in blackouts, where shortages meant reusing bandages until they fell apart. He realized then that what he witnessed was not only medical care, but a demonstration of national power. Every gauze square, every vial of plasma, every clean sheet was proof of factories, of logistics, of a system so vast that it reached even into the life of a wounded enemy soldier. At night, lying awake under the hiss of lanterns, Kenji stared at the white canvas ceiling and wondered what kind of country could fight a global war and still spare so much care for its prisoners. He had no answer, only the growing sense that the world he had believed in was dissolving under the touch of foreign hands that healed instead of harmed. August 12, 1944, Naval Base Hospital, No. 18, Aiea Heights, Oahu, Hawaii. After 2 weeks at sea aboard a hospital transport, Kenji Nakamura found himself carried up a ramp into a vast building of wood and plaster that looked more like a university than a prison. The air was cooler here, washed by trade winds. The scent of plumeria drifted faintly through the open windows, even as the smell of antiseptic filled the wards. His cot was one among hundreds lined in rows beneath ceiling fans that turned lazily above. The orderlies pushed him past rooms where nurses in crisp white uniforms checked instruments laid out in trays, where surgeons spoke in calm tones while adjusting masks, where clerks shuffled through stacks of charts and papers that seemed to record every pulse and temperature. Kenji's thigh wound, healing well, had earned him transfer from the forward hospital to this rear facility for convalescents. What he saw overwhelmed him. Polished floors, electric lights glowing in every corridor, elevators that carried patients between floors, entire rooms full of bottled plasma and drugs. He thought of the bamboo huts back in Manchuria, where comrades had died of dysentery without even a bed to lie on, where bandages were boiled and used until they dissolved, and he felt the dissonance like a fever in his chest. The doctor who examined him here wore wire-rimmed glasses and spoke through an interpreter with precise courtesy. His wound was closing, no infection, walking again in weeks. Kenji bowed his head in thanks, words sticking in his throat. Around him, the hospital embodied the scale of America's medical war effort. Naval Base Hospital Number 18, built in less than a year, could treat over 1,500 patients at once, with operating rooms running continuously and wards specialized for burns, fractures, chest wounds, and tropical diseases. At its peak, Hawaii's network of base hospitals treated tens of thousands of casualties from the Pacific campaigns, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, and soon Peleliu. Supplies arrived daily in convoys, ships unloading tons of medical cargo, sterile gauze by the bale, morphine syrettes by the crate, surgical instruments by the thousands. Statistics staggered the mind. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 12 million units of blood plasma, 2 billion sulfa tablets, and more than 600 billion aspirin tablets. By contrast, Japanese production struggled to supply even home hospitals, where shortages forced families to improvise bandages from old cloth. Kenji heard one interpreter tell a wounded comrade that in the United States, every small-town hospital was better equipped than Japan's largest army facility. At first, Kenji dismissed it as exaggeration, but each day he lived in this ward made it harder to doubt. The hospital ran with the precision of a factory. Nurses carried charts from bed to bed. Orderlies wheeled carts of clean linen. Surgeons worked in shifts so operations never ceased. Even the meals astonished him. Trays of eggs, milk, fruit, coffee. "This is standard," the interpreter said. Standard. The word echoed in Kenji's mind with terrible weight. Kenji's days followed a new rhythm, one that blurred the line between enemy and patient. Each morning, he was helped to sit upright. His bandages changed with practiced efficiency. In the afternoons, he was taken with other prisoners to a sunlit veranda, where they sat in rows of wheelchairs, breathing fresh air while looking down over Pearl Harbor's vast anchorage. From that height, Kenji could see dozens of ships at anchor. Aircraft carriers, battleships, transports, each one larger than anything Japan could now float. He counted them in silence, their gray hulls lined up like an iron forest, cranes unloading cargo, tugs guiding new arrivals. The interpreter explained that many of these ships had been damaged at Saipan and Guam, but repaired in days by the Navy's shipyard below. Kenji remembered how months were needed in Japan to patch a single destroyer, and the comparison hollowed him. At night, from his bed, he could hear the music drifting up from the USO shows staged for the American wounded. Swing bands playing bright brass, women's voices laughing. Sometimes the nurses invited prisoners to watch from the veranda. Kenji saw one Marine with both legs gone tapping time with his hand, smiling at a song. It unsettled him. He had been taught that Westerners were cold, selfish, weak. Yet here was cheer shared among wounded men, and even offered to prisoners without mockery. Letters arrived for the Americans, read aloud by chaplains or nurses, words of wives and children carried across the Pacific. Kenji listened, though he could not understand, only hearing the warmth in the voices. For prisoners there was nothing, of course. Japan would not acknowledge their survival. Yet the staff allowed prisoners to write if they wished, promising that Red Cross channels might one day deliver them. Kenji held the pencil awkwardly, wrote a few halting lines to his parents in Nagano, and handed it back, uncertain if it would ever cross the ocean. The act itself astonished him. To be permitted, even encouraged, to write home. No one mocked his words, no one tore up the page. When he asked why, the interpreter said simply, "Because you are human." Kenji lay awake that night repeating the phrase, "Because you are human." In his training, captured soldiers were no longer human. They were ghosts, shameful shadows. But here the enemy seemed to see only the wound, the body, the man. This thought unsettled him more deeply than any rifle had, for it suggested that everything he had believed might be hollow. September 2nd, 1944, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The ward was quiet in the early dawn, the ceiling fans still spinning above, when Kenji Nakamura swung his legs carefully over the side of the bed. His crutch leaned against the frame, polished smooth by weeks of use. He pressed his bare foot to the cool tile and felt a jolt of pride at how far he had come since that day on Saipan, when shrapnel had torn through his thigh. A corpsman noticed and hurried over, steadying him as though he were a comrade rather than an enemy. "Take it slow," the young man said through the Nisei interpreter, his tone the same he had used for an American soldier only moments before. Kenji nodded and took 3 halting steps, the crutch supporting his weight, his body trembling with the effort. Applause rippled softly from nearby beds, Americans and Japanese alike. It embarrassed him, but it also filled his chest with something unfamiliar. The sense that survival was not shameful here. Later, a nurse showed him how to wrap a fresh dressing himself, guiding his hand, correcting his motion gently until he managed it alone. When he bowed in thanks, she returned the bow without hesitation. Kenji felt his throat tighten. He was still a prisoner, still marked by the rising sun sewn on his old uniform folded in storage somewhere. Yet here he was, treated as a man who deserved to walk again. Beyond the hospital windows, the war thundered on. In Europe, Paris had been liberated just days earlier, on August 25th, and Allied armies were pushing toward the German border. In the Pacific, American forces were preparing to assault Peleliu in the Palau Islands, an operation that would claim thousands of lives in the coming weeks. Ships streamed in and out of Pearl Harbor constantly. Carriers restocking aircraft, tankers refueling the fleet, transports loading men and supplies for the next leap across the ocean. Kenji could see them from the veranda, dozens of gray silhouettes in motion, cranes swinging loads of crates, trucks rumbling along the docks. The numbers staggered him. The U.S. Pacific Fleet now boasted more than 90 carriers, over 20 battleships, and thousands of support vessels. In the same harbor where Japan had once struck in triumph, the enemy now assembled a force greater than anything in human history. Yet alongside that steel was a quieter power. The base hospitals where more than 30,000 wounded had been treated since the Marianas campaign began. Doctors rotated in 12-hour shifts, nurses logged thousands of dressings changed each week, and warehouses tallied their supplies not in dozens or hundreds, but in tons. Kenji heard one officer say that penicillin production in America had reached 650 billion units per year. The figure was beyond imagination. Japan's chemists whispered of penicillin as a rumor. Here it flowed like water, even into the veins of prisoners. As his strength returned, Kenji was assigned light duties, folding sheets, sweeping floors, helping orderlies push carts of supplies. At first he did so with reluctance, ashamed to labor for the enemy, but soon he noticed that American patients greeted him with nods rather than scorn. One Marine, his arm gone at the shoulder, asked him for help adjusting a pillow. Kenji did so, and the man grinned in thanks. Another time, he watched a nurse scold a prisoner who refused to eat, her tone sharp but her eyes concerned. She spoke no Japanese, yet the message was clear. Recovery was expected of them all. The lines between friend and foe blurred in those small acts. On Sundays, chaplains offered services in the chapel. Prisoners were not required to attend, yet some did, curious. Kenji went once, listening to hymns he did not understand, but the voices stirred something in him all the same. Later that day, volunteers from Honolulu brought baskets of fruit and magazines for the American wounded, and to Kenji's astonishment, the nurses distributed some to prisoners as well. He bit into a fresh pineapple slice, its sweetness flooding his mouth, and thought of his family in Nagano scraping through rationed rice and barley. Shame and gratitude wrestled in him until he could not tell which weighed more. By early September, Kenji could walk with only a cane. Discharge from the hospital meant transfer to a POW camp on the mainland, perhaps California or Arkansas. He dreaded it, fearing that once away from the doctors and nurses, he would again be reduced to an enemy number. Yet on the morning of departure, as he was led to the waiting transport truck, the staff lined the ward to bid farewell not only to him but to dozens of patients, American and Japanese alike. The nurse who had first changed his dressings pressed a small card into his hand. On it she had written a simple phrase in Japanese, painstakingly copied from a phrase book: "Get well, live long." He bowed deeply, unable to speak. The interpreter clapped him on the shoulder, telling him that someday, perhaps, his family would hear that he had lived. As the truck rumbled down toward the harbor, Kenji looked back at the white hospital buildings gleaming on the hillside. He realized that what had shaken him most was not the scale of American industry, nor even the endless supplies of medicine. It was the quiet consistency with which these strangers had treated him as a man worth saving. In that revelation, he felt the collapse of everything he had been told about honor, shame, and the enemy. He did not yet know what it meant for Japan or for himself, but he knew with certainty that the first time an American doctor pressed a bandage to his wound and said, "Okay," something inside him had changed forever. September 18, 1944, Angel Island, San Francisco Bay. The fog lay low over the water as the transport ship slid beneath the Golden Gate, its red towers vanishing into mist. From the deck where prisoners clustered under guard, Kenji Nakamura felt the chill seep into his bones and pulled his Zalcon, borrowed wool blanket tighter. It was the first time he had seen the American mainland, and the view stunned him. Warehouses lined the piers for miles. Cranes lifted cargo with mechanical ease. Trains waited on sidings, their cars stretching into the distance. The city rose beyond, a forest of buildings lit even in daylight by electric signs, streetcars rattling along rails, automobiles threading through traffic in numbers that defied imagination. Kenji had grown up in Nagano, where a single bus was a marvel, where electricity reached homes late, if at all. Here, he saw abundance as ordinary as air. He remembered the American nurse's card tucked in his pocket. "Get well, live long," and wondered what kind of nation could produce both kindness and such vast power. As they disembarked, the prisoners were counted and filed into trucks. Civilians along the streets stopped to stare, not with hatred, but with curiosity. Children pointed, some waved, and the guards did not strike them back into line. Kenji bowed his head, ashamed, but when he dared glance up, he saw only ordinary faces, not the jeering mob he had expected. The prisoners were bound for camps across the country, part of a system that by autumn 1944 held nearly 400,000 Axis soldiers. Kenji's group was sent inland by train, the journey itself another lesson. Instead of freight wagons, they rode in passenger coaches with padded seats, observation cars where they could see the countryside unroll. miles of farmland, grain elevators rising like castles, towns glowing with neon signs at dusk. Even the guards seemed relaxed, some sharing cigarettes, some pointing out landmarks. One told the interpreter, "This is Kansas wheat country," as fields stretched to the horizon. Kenji listened and felt his chest tighten. He knew from whispers in the ward that Japan's rice harvest was failing, that hunger was spreading. Here, food grew in oceans of green and gold. When the train stopped at a small town station, civilians pressed close. A vendor handed sandwiches to the guards, who bought extras for themselves and ate without hurry. Kenji saw thick meat, crisp lettuce, white bread. He could not look away. A guard noticed, paused, then handed him half with a shrug. Kenji stared at it, more food than his family might see in a day, and ate slowly, each bite both pleasure and humiliation. The sandwich was not propaganda, not a staged show. It was simply how Americans ate on an ordinary Tuesday. His final destination was Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico, one of dozens of camps spread across the United States. The desert stretched flat and empty, yet within its wire perimeters lay barracks with electric lights, mess halls with steam kettles, infirmaries with stocked cabinets. The camp held thousands of prisoners, Germans from Africa, Italians from Sicily, and now Japanese from the Marianas. Kenji was assigned to a barrack with men who still muttered about shame and suicide. Yet each evening they ate hot meals, beef stew, bread, vegetables, and each morning they marched to showers with running water. The camp infirmary checked his wound weekly, changing dressings, measuring progress. The American doctor there, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, explained through the interpreter that Kenji would recover full strength. "You are lucky," he said. "Infection killed many men before sulfa. Now, most live." Kenji bowed, words failing him again. He realized then that what he had seen on Saipan and Hawaii was not an exception, not a trick of mercy. It was system, built into the very machinery of this enemy nation. Each lamp that burned in the barracks, each pill swallowed in the infirmary, each meal ladled onto a tray, was a fact heavier than any bullet. Kenji's nights were restless. He dreamed of comrades who had died in caves, of officers who had shouted that Americans would torture prisoners. Instead, he woke to breakfast with coffee steaming in tin cups. He dreamed of Tokyo radio voices declaring America bankrupt, its people starving. Instead, he watched trains deliver endless supplies to the camp. Coal for heating, crates of food, even musical instruments for the camp orchestra. He dreamed of shame, but woke to life. And in that contradiction, something inside him shifted permanently. December 24th, 1944, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. The desert wind swept cold across the barbed wire, rattling the tin roofs of the barracks. But inside the mess hall, a warmth glowed that Kenji Nakamura could not reconcile with the word prison. Rows of long wooden tables had been set with extra care. The American guards, smiling a little awkwardly, had arranged a Christmas dinner not only for their own staff, but for the prisoners. Kenji sat shoulder to shoulder with Germans, Italians, and a few dozen Japanese from Saipan, each of them holding a tin tray piled with food that seemed impossible in wartime. Turkey carved thick, potatoes drowned in gravy, vegetables buttered and salted, pies with flaky crusts, and coffee poured until cups overflowed. He ate slowly, almost reverently, tasting each bite as though it might vanish like a dream. The guards explained through interpreters that local churchwomen had baked cakes, that civic groups had donated candy, that children had sent handmade cards. Some cards were handed out at random, scrawled in childish English. "Merry Christmas to our prisoners." Kenji held one in his hands, staring at the crooked letters. He could not imagine such a gesture happening in Japan for captured enemies. The broader war thundered beyond the wire even as the camp sang. In Europe, the Battle of the Bulge raged in the Ardennes, with tens of thousands of casualties in the snow. In the Pacific, American forces closed on Luzon, and Iwo Jima loomed on the horizon of planning. Yet here in the desert, thousands of miles from front lines, men who had tried to kill Americans 6 months earlier were being fed like honored guests. Statistics told the story better than sentiment. By year's end, America held over 425,000 Axis prisoners across more than 500 camps, from Texas cotton fields to Wisconsin forests. Each camp consumed tons of food, thousands of gallons of fuel, mountains of medical supplies. The cost was staggering, but to the Americans it was simply part of the war effort. They treated prisoners not only because the Geneva Convention demanded it, but because their system could afford to. The abundance was not theater, it was infrastructure. And for men like Kenji, who had grown up under scarcity, it was a revelation more devastating than any defeat in battle. Over the winter months, Kenji found himself assigned to light labor. Prisoners were trucked out daily to help harvest cotton, repair fences, or unload supplies, always under guard, but rarely mistreated. What shocked him was not the work itself, but what he saw along the way. American farms with tractors pulling machines larger than Japanese barns. Silos filled with grain high as towers. Workers, sometimes women, sometimes Mexican laborers, eating lunches with more meat than Kenji had seen in a year of rations. Even the guards' casual wealth disturbed him. Cigarettes smoked halfway and thrown away, gloves of good leather discarded when worn thin. They live as though resources are endless, he whispered to another prisoner one day, and the other man nodded in silence. Back in the barracks, Kenji joined English classes offered to any prisoner willing. He sat with Germans reciting simple words: bread, house, family. He realized with a jolt that these Americans wanted even their enemies to learn, to prepare for life after war. No one forced them, but the classroom filled anyway, men hungry for knowledge after years of propaganda. Kenji copied letters into a notebook until his hand cramped, ashamed of his halting script, but proud that he could begin to read signs in the camp. Learning itself felt like liberation. By spring 1945, Kenji's leg was strong enough to walk unaided, though a limp remained. He spent evenings on the barrack steps, watching the desert sun fall behind the mountains, the sky burning red. He thought often of the nurse's card, "Get well, live long," and of the American doctor who had treated his wound as if it belonged to one of their own. He thought of the hospital ship rocking gently in the Pacific, of plasma dripping from a bottle into his arm, of the sandwich handed to him by a guard on the train. Each memory contradicted the lessons of his training, and together they built a new truth: that mercy could be as powerful as steel, that dignity could exist even for the defeated. When the radio crackled news in May that Germany had surrendered, the camp erupted in cheers among guards and stunned silence among prisoners. A German near Kenji whispered, "So it ends." Kenji said nothing, but he knew then that Japan too would fall. The arithmetic was too clear. America's industry, its ships, its medicine, its humanity. No empire built on scarcity and cruelty could withstand such abundance. On August 15, 1945, the camp loudspeaker announced Japan's surrender. Kenji sat in silence, his head bowed, tears he could not control running down his cheeks. Around him, other Japanese prisoners wept or sat stone-faced, but the guards gave them space, offering no jeers, only silence. That evening, the chaplain read a prayer for peace, and interpreters explained that the war was over, that soon they would be sent home. Kenji's heart felt torn. He longed for Nagano, for his family, for the land of his birth. Yet he knew he would never forget what he had seen here. Wounds treated without cruelty, food shared without malice, kindness extended without demand. When he finally boarded a ship for Japan in early 1946, he limped up the gangway with a cane, carrying nothing but a small bag of clothes and the card the nurse had given him. He pressed it to his chest as the coastline of America faded into the mist. He knew he would return to a ruined homeland, to hunger and ashes. But he also knew something else, that a different kind of future was possible, one he had glimpsed in the white sheets of a hospital ward, in the steady hand of an American doctor, in the simple mercy of being allowed to live. And that knowledge, more than any weapon, was what he carried home.